After the release of chapter 222 of Jujutsu Kaisen, it was clear to everyone that Satoru Gojo's final fight against Ryomen Sukuna was closer than ever expected. The weekly release notes from Shonen Jump magazine in Japan even went as far to say that the battle between the strongest is about to begin, and with the release of chapter 223, the battle seems to be underway. Between chapters 221 and 222, however, there's been a surprising month-long time skip, and we can only assume that during this time, Gojo and his students have been preparing for the biggest fight the Jujutsu world has ever seen. We know our good guys like Yuji and Kusakabe have been training, but even people like Sukuna began regaining their strength, even reaching about 20 fingers of power. But of course this begs the question, what's Gojo's plan going into the fight with one of the strongest sorcerers to ever live? In this video, I'll be going over Gojo's possible plans, strategies, and advantages for his final battle with the King of Curses. If you would enjoy more JJK content, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and comment on some video ideas you want to see be done down below. The first thing that's really important when looking at Gojo going into this fight is his attitude and demeanor. When we compare how Gojo is walking into this room in chapter 222 in comparison to how he shows up in Shibuya, they're almost two completely different people. In chapter 83, when Gojo shows up in Shibuya, when he finally sees the disaster curses, he's actually smiling and laughing, and he's clearly not taking them all too seriously. He even goes as far as joking around with Jogo and tells him that he shouldn't make any excuses if he loses this time. It's only until Jogo and Hanami activate domain amplification and Choso ends up using his curse technique to kill some of the people in the train station when Gojo lifts up his blindfold and begins taking them a little bit more seriously. Even if we go all the way back to his first fight with Jogo, he doesn't really seem to take him all too seriously, and he does a lot of the things that he does in Shibuya. Gojo's not exactly known for taking his opponent seriously, but the fact that he looks like this before going into this fight, it really just speaks volumes on Gojo's resolve and mindset, and it lets us know that Gojo knows that he's gonna have to take this fight seriously and really give it his all if he plans on winning this fight. Part of Gojo's strategy is him understanding that he's gonna need to take this fight seriously if he plans on winning, and that he can't do the things that he normally does. We really see this best in action in chapter 222 when Yuji asked Gojo to turn off his infinity. What's weird about this is that we know that Gojo has a system for automatically turning off his infinity when coming into contact with things that shouldn't be a threat to him based on the mass, speed, and shape and intensity of cursed energy. Based on the factors that were mentioned, Gojo's infinity should not stop somebody like Yuji from coming into contact with him, but for some reason, his infinity seems to be on. This could be either one of two things. Gojo may have lowered the settings for the factors I've mentioned before in order to stop even weaker threats from getting through his infinity. Basically, Gojo's targeting system for his infinity might just be a lot more sensitive to weaker threats in comparison to how it was before. Depending on how sensitive his infinity is, it can stop nearly all threats from approaching him, even ones with a very low intensity of cursed energy or ones with low mass, speed, or shape. The other possibility is that Gojo might have his infinity on manually like he did before. Without having to make the assumption that Gojo can adjust the settings to his infinity, this would be the most likely option. We know the biggest downside to having infinity on manually is that it can really tire out Gojo and make him fatigued. However, it's important to remember that the only time that this ever happened was when Gojo had his infinity on for days on end. If we assume that Gojo won't have to keep his infinity on for that long, if we also take into account that now he has reverse curse technique and he can constantly keep his brain fresh at all times, it means that Gojo might now be able to use infinity manually without the issues that he had before. Regardless if you believe if it's option 1 or option 2, Gojo either having his infinity on at all times or making it even harder for threats to pass through, it makes it even more unlikely, if it wasn't already a certainty, that Gojo won't get caught off guard by things that may have slipped past his infinity before. It's also important to take into account where these two are going to be fighting. The place where Gojo is fighting is unlike any other place that he's ever fought before. The Culling Games being a giant absolute wasteland is perfect for somebody like Gojo. All the way back in Shibuya in chapter 84, Kenjaku tells Jogo that Gojo is only in his element when he's alone. The thing that held Gojo back in Shibuya when he was fighting the disaster curses was that he was surrounded by people, and specifically non-sorcerers. Kenjaku says that it doesn't really matter who it is, anyone that fights alongside Gojo would just end up holding him back. And because of other factors like the cursed energy being outputted from Gojo's attacks being leaked on non-sorcerers, it restricted Gojo's moveset and didn't allow him to fight like he normally does, even when he's not taking his opponent seriously. This was undoubtedly a major factor in Gojo getting sealed, and it's clearly a big detriment to the way he fights. But now that Gojo has an environment to fight in like the Culling Games, none of the really important aspects that held Gojo back in Shibuya are currently present. There's absolutely no people in the vicinity for miles. And when we take a look at this week's chapter at JJK, chapter 223, it's clear to everyone that Gojo is making full use of this opportunity. Gojo begins the fight launching a massive hollow purple at Sukuna, which completely destroys the environment. I never thought Gojo would ever care about the environment, but the fact that he can just let go and launch a hollow purple that would destroy anything in its path, including the various buildings and skyscrapers, without Gojo having to worry about people being inside because of the nature of the Culling Games, it means that Gojo has now realized the opportunity he has with nobody around, and he's planning on taking full advantage of it. And when we also think about how this is really just the appetizer for what's to come, and it's only the introduction for the biggest fight the series has ever seen, it makes me think that Gojo still has more cards up in his sleeve. There's still opportunities to use other techniques like blue or red, or maybe even brand new hollow techniques that we haven't seen yet that he picked up in the box, but that's simply a theory. The best move Gojo has in his arsenal besides Hollow Purple for quickly turning the tide of battle is gonna be his domain. We saw how powerful Gojo's all or nothing domain expansion could be if it was used strategically. We saw that during Shibuya, if Gojo can manage to make a quick play with his domain, he can easily turn the tide of battle. It's also important to take into account that Gojo can fight for a very long time. Because Gojo has reverse curse technique not only to keep his brain fresh, but to also heal his body, it means that Gojo can essentially fight forever until he runs out of cursed energy. One very important thing about Gojo using reverse curse technique is that we don't know the level of proficiency that he has using the ability. During the Culling games alone, we have 2 mentions of a higher level reverse curse technique. The first is during the Sendai Colony arc during Ryu's fight with Yuta. Ryu mentions that even using reverse curse technique, trying to regenerate an arm is one hell of a feat. The second time reverse curse technique is mentioned during the Culling games is during Kashima's fight with Akari. After Kashima poisons Akari and renders him unconscious, he mentions that it requires a higher form of reverse curse technique to actually remove toxins. While both of these are higher level feats using reverse curse technique that we don't know if Gojo can replicate, I still believe reverse curse technique is going to be a major game changer in this battle, because even though Gojo can only use it till he runs out of cursed energy, that's exactly his greatest advantage. By Gojo using the 6 eyes, he can conserve a massive amount of cursed energy, meaning Gojo can spam his curse techniques like red, blue, and even purple, while still conserving cursed energy to use reverse curse technique. We also see in chapter 223 that Gojo seems to be bringing people with him to go fight Sukuna. While this may seem like a blatant contradiction to the idea that Gojo can only go all out when people aren't near him, the benefits that these people bring when they're fighting alongside Gojo might just be too beneficial for Gojo to pass up. We see this best displayed during the fight's introduction in chapter 223. In the last chapter, we saw Gojo walking up to the battlefield with Gakuganji and Yudahime, but we didn't exactly know why. It's revealed in this chapter that both of them actually play a very important role in Gojo's battle with Sukuna. It's revealed that Yudahime's curse technique is actually solo Prohibition Zone. Her curse technique has the ability to enhance the output and reserve of any sorcerer of her choosing, including herself, and this effect can continue temporarily as long as they stay in range. Gojo, being someone who was already viewed as one of the strongest people around, having his cursed energy reserves and output temporarily enhanced means he's now even more of a monster than he was before. From the moment Gojo entered the battlefield, he realized some of his advantages and began acting on these opportunities without even hesitating. If Gojo can keep being supported by people like Yudahime, while also keeping them at a faraway distance to where they don't hold Gojo back, it means that Gojo now has the perfect opportunity and strategy to fully beat down somebody like Sukuna. However, in Gojo's strategy, I believe it's highly likely that there's actually a plan B, a plan that if everything goes wrong, our heroes can still end up winning the battle. In chapter 222, Kenjaku actually implies that even if Gojo loses, Sukuna will be left in such a poor condition that it would actually give the rest of Gojo's fighting force a chance to defeat Sukuna. The main people from this fighting force that are shown on panel is Maki, Yuta, and Akari. Each of these fighters on their own have abilities that can pose a threat to Sukuna, depending on the condition he's left in after his fight with Satoru Gojo. Akari, for example, has the ability to enter a state called Jackpot. Jackpot mode grants Akari an infinite amount of cursed energy, which causes his body to reflexively perform reverse curse technique, meaning he's nearly unkillable for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. But for Akari to enter Jackpot mode, it's actually a little bit more complicated than it seems. Akari needs to open up his domain expansion called Idle Death Gamble, and inside of his domain expansion, Akari has to play some sort of game. The game that Akari plays is based on a real-life pachinko machine, and he has to play the game and win in order to enter Jackpot mode. While Jackpot mode only lasts for about 4 minutes and 11 seconds, Sukuna facing a nearly unkillable opponent will definitely be tough, especially after a fight with Satoru Gojo. While there is actually a way to take down Akari by destroying his head in one blow, we don't know the condition Sukuna is going to be in after his fight with Satoru Gojo, and we don't know if he's actually going to be able to pull this off. For example, if this happens after a domain expansion, because we know domain expansions can leave a temporary effect and limitation on people's curse techniques, we don't know if Sukuna is going to have access to things like the fire arrow or even cleave and dismantle to fully cut down Akari. And then if we take other fighters into account like Yuta Okotsu, Yuta possesses a boundless amount of cursed energy and can fight alongside a cursed spirit named Rika. Rika is also Yuta's external storage. Rika holds things for Yuta ranging anywhere from weaponry to the boundless amount of cursed energy that I mentioned earlier. Once Rika is completely manifested, Yuta has access to an arsenal of weapons ranging anywhere from katanas to actual armor. Rika also has enough cursed energy to constantly refill Yuta as long as he needs. But undoubtedly the best thing that Rika holds for Yuta is his curse techniques. Yuta has the ability to copy other curse techniques, but because his brain would explode when trying to hold multiple curse techniques, he has to use Rika for external storage. As of chapter 223, we only know about 2 of the curse techniques that Yuta has in his possession. The first in his arsenal of curse techniques is Curse Speech. Just like Inumaki, by infusing sound with cursed energy, Yuta can impose various commands on his opponents that they're forced to follow. He can command his opponents to literally do anything, from simply standing still to literally dying, as he commands Geto's curse spirits in JJK Volume 0. The second confirmed curse technique that we know Yuta possesses in his arsenal is Sky Manipulation. manipulation. Yuta can treat the sky as a surface and pull and contort the sky to his desire. Yuta can also use abilities like the Icebreaker, which doesn't actually tag the opponent itself, but instead breaks the surface that touches the opponent and cracks it like thin ice. He can use sky manipulation in combination with his curse spirit named Rika to land massive blows on his opponents. Yuta possessing reverse curse technique and having naturally high volumes of cursed energy means that just like Gojo, he can also fight for a very long time. Everything in Yuta's arsenal that I've mentioned so far, along with him having his own domain expansion, means that after a fight with Satoru Gojo, he too will pose a threat to Sukuna depending on his current condition. The last character specifically referenced is Maki Zenin. Out of these three characters, Maki is the only one who has actually interacted with Sukuna in the past. Maki had fought alongside Yuji to attempt to capture Sukuna when he was around 15 fingers of power. Throughout this entire fight, Maki seems to be Sukuna's main focus. Aside from Sukuna never actually taking his eyes off Maki throughout the entire fight to look at Yuji, he even continues to remark at the end of the fight to Urame that it was actually the right choice to primarily focus cursed energy on Maki. It's important to note that this is only a 15-finger Sukuna whose output was nerfed when attempting to use his curse technique. But after having a fight with Satoru Gojo, it's possible that Sukuna might be weak enough for Maki to come in and completely cut down the King of Curses using her sword. Maki's sword in particular is unlike any other sword that we've ever seen. By using her curse technique creation, Maki's sister Mai Zenin was able to create an exact replica of Toji's curse tool, the Soul Liberation Blade. This sword in particular is extremely useful because it ignores the durability of anything it attempts to cut by cutting the soul directly. Maki can not only see the souls of people, but also the souls of inanimate objects, meaning she can cut down any obstacle that Sukuna puts in her way, or even maybe Sukuna himself. There's been many theories floating around regarding Maki being able to cut Sukuna in half and separating his soul from Megami's, but that's simply a theory. The main thing to take away from all this is that just like Kenjaku says, if Satoru Gojo really does lose to Ryoma and Sukuna, it'll be their only opportunity to take down the King of Curses, and depending on Sukuna's condition, all three of these fighters have their own abilities and strengths to give Sukuna a tough time. So even if Gojo uses the opportunities and advantages that I mentioned earlier and still ends up losing to Ryoma and Sukuna, his plan B may be enough to win in the long term. Gojo not being the person to actually kill Ryoma and Sukuna is not an idea that hasn't possibly been foreshadowed in the past. We know that even all the way back in chapter 3, when this matchup was originally teased, Sukuna says that he'd be the one to kill Gojo, but when Gojo's asked by Yuji if he can actually beat Sukuna, he just says that he'd win. The same idea of Gojo winning is later reinforced again in chapter 221. After Gojo was released from the prison realm, Sukuna and Gojo end up clashing, and Sukuna even reminds Gojo of the promise that he made all the way back in chapter 3. However, when asked by Kenjaku if he really thinks he can win against Ryoma and Sukuna, Gojo ends up thinking back to the exact conversation he had with Yuji in chapter 3 and reinforces the same idea that he'd win against Sukuna. There's actually a scenario where both Gojo and Sukuna's predictions for this fight both end up coming true. When we take a deeper look at Sukuna's prediction for this fight, it's pretty clear and simple that he thinks he'll be the one to kill Satoru Gojo. But when we take a deeper look at Gojo's prediction for this fight, his answer is a little bit more complicated. While Gojo could win by killing Sukuna, winning does not exactly have to entail Gojo winning the fight. When Gojo begins training Megami after the Goodwill event, we actually get a little bit more insight on what exactly Gojo could be meaning when he says winning. Gojo begins explaining to Megami that he doesn't understand how to bring out his best self, and Megami's performance in the baseball game is the perfect example. When Megami ends up stepping to the plate, he performs a sacrifice bunt so that he can guarantee a way for Nobara to advance. But when we compare somebody like Yuji, Yuji is always swinging for the fences, and he's not the type of person to perform a sacrifice bunt. When playing baseball, a sacrifice bunt isn't a bad strategy, but that's because baseball is a team sport where everybody's expected to play their own role. But as opposed to sorcery, being a Jujutsu sorcerer is an individual sport. Gojo says that coordinating with allies is important, but no matter how many allies you have around you, you always end up dying alone. Gojo tells Megami that right now, he's underestimating himself and the others around him, and what Megami should be doing is envisioning a stronger version of himself to become in the near future. Up until this point, whenever Megami is faced with a tough situation, he resorts to summoning his ace up his sleeve, Maharaga. Gojo says that Maharaga is the ace up Megami's sleeve, that he thinks that even in the worst case scenario, if he were to sacrifice himself in order to save everyone, his death would make things alright in the end. But Gojo says that if Megami keeps thinking like that, he can forget ever being as strong as him, and that he won't even match up to Nanami. Gojo tells Megami that winning by dying and winning even if you die are two completely different things. This could be foreshadowing for the battle that we begin to see in chapter 223. If Gojo does end up dying to Sukuna, it can still lead to him winning in the long term. We know that Gojo's overall goal is to build up his students to one day act as allies in his political battle against the higher-ups of the Jujutsu world. However, as most of you guys know, in chapter 223, all of the higher-ups were mysteriously killed. But from what Gojo says in chapter 11, killing all the higher-ups doesn't really solve anything because new evil would just end up taking their place. So just like Kobe said,
still to be happy about.
You're up 2-0.
Job's not finished. Job finished? I don't think so. Sasuke.
Gojo dying against Sukuna and giving his students the opportunity to finish the fight may be just a chance for them all to grow in power to that level above special grade that Gojo was talking about. Gojo winning by dying and then his students trying to win even if they die means Gojo can still win in the long term, and both Sukuna and Gojo's predictions could actually be correct. His students will still have a chance to finish the fight for him and grow to that level of power that Gojo's been talking about for the entire series and lead to a victory for Satoru Gojo, making this Gojo's perfect plan for winning against Sukuna. If you enjoyed Jujutsu Kaisen content, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and comment on some video ideas you want to see be done down below.